Ever wonder why people ask, what happened to Tartaria's treasure? Why doesn't anyone discuss it? Here's what makes this strange. We're not dealing with a pirate tale here. There's no weathered treasure chest, no skull-marked chart, no obvious X marking the spot. What you actually discover are historical maps showing Tartaria labeled casually, like it's completely ordinary, and then it simply vanishes from later editions. No major declaration preceded its disappearance. It just evaporated. Whenever Tartaria's treasure gets mentioned, an identical pattern emerges. Discussions become unstable, sources get branded as rubbish, and the trail transforms into mockery, fraud, and dead silence. What if that's intentional, though? What if treasure doesn't indicate a single hidden vault, but rather flowing assets, taxation revenue, wartime funds, confiscated riches, smelted ingots, the sort of wealth that gets renamed, reclassified, and consumed by emerging power structures? Following the documentary evidence reveals a recurring pattern. Designations shift, archives get restructured, stairways become sealed, underground levels undergo renovation, and history gets relabeled until it appears innocuous. Consider this question. If the wealth existed and was seized, who profits from ensuring you never discover what terms to investigate? My search didn't begin with buried riches when I started examining antique maps. I was hunting for a designation. Just a designation. Tartaria. You've likely encountered it drifting through online comments, internet jokes, those video platform thumbnails featuring sensational question marks and bright red circles highlighting faded text. Honestly, I anticipated discovering garbage, misspellings, poor reproductions, some 16th century cartographer speculating about boundaries he'd never witnessed. What I actually found proved stranger. Map after map repeatedly across centuries, marking an enormous territory with identical terminology. Not concealed in footnotes, not scrawled in margins, printed directly in the center, bold, clear, official. Grande Tartarie, Tartarie, independent Tartarie. French cartography contains it. British maps show it. Dutch, German, Italian sources, different tongues, different empires, identical designation. It's not presented mockingly, but rather as a location you should recognize, a territory significant enough to warrant naming. Then, by the middle 19th century, it doesn't exist anymore. No official proclamation, no peace agreement erasing a frontier, no prominent headline announcing Tartary's end in London publications. The designation simply fades away. That's when I understood I'd been pursuing incorrect questions, because searching for explanations didn't yield serious scholarly debate matching what appeared on those maps. Instead, I encountered swift rejections, tidy ones, the variety that terminates discussions rapidly. It never constituted an actual nation, merely a vague designation for territories Europeans couldn't comprehend. A cartographic substitute like underscore, quote, underscore one, underscore, but for the steps. All right, fine, but then clarify this. Why does the designation persist on serious maps for 400 years? Why do numerous European authorities chart roughly identical regions using identical terminology? Why does the word vanish around the same period, precisely when railroads, telegraphs, and modern financial systems begin connecting the world together? That doesn't seem like a simple mapping convention disappearing. It feels like silence descending. Here's the aspect that made me reconsider everything. The instant people mention Tartaria's treasure, not the jokes, not the cheap manipulations, but the genuine inquiry about what occurred to wealth connected with that territory. The discussion doesn't merely conclude, it transforms. Abruptly, sources become discredited. Abruptly, the entire subject becomes internet conspiracy theory. Abruptly, you're forbidden from asking about commerce routes, taxation, and war plunder without getting lumped with every absurd story online. That reaction, the rapid pivot from a reasonable question to immediate mockery, was the second element that drew me deeper. Because when something truly seems silly, people laugh and continue onward. They don't construct barriers around it. When a subject makes institutions uncomfortable, though, the response typically isn't laughter, but distance, labels, a courteous but firm "don't venture there." Let me clarify what this investigation represents and what it doesn't. I'm not offering you a treasure chart with an X. I'm not peddling shovels. I'm not requesting you believe anything on faith. What I will do is follow the documentary trail. Because treasure doesn't require meaning one chest beneath a demolished fortress. Treasure can indicate tax revenue accumulated across decades. Treasure can indicate war seizures taken during a single campaign. Treasure can indicate family heirlooms melted into bars. Treasure can indicate trade commodities converted to bullion, transferred quietly from record to record. The variety of wealth empires consumed during expansion. The variety of wealth that gets renamed when borders get redrawn. The variety of wealth that vanishes not because it disappears, but because the documentation tracking it gets sealed, reclassified, or quietly relocated to a basement nobody visits anymore. If that's what transpired here, if genuine wealth connected to a genuine territory existed, and the territory itself got relabeled out of memory, then I want to understand whose wealth it was and who ended up possessing it when the designation Tartaria finally disappeared from cartography. Because the maps retain memory even when we're instructed not to inquire. The maps proved strange enough, but cartography doesn't typically make people anxious. Maps hang in museums, get framed, become wallpaper in cafes wanting to appear sophisticated. What makes people anxious is currency. The deeper I investigated the Tartaria question, the more I kept encountering identical quiet whispers appearing where they shouldn't. Antique auction house notes casually mentioning Tartarian provenance beside jewelry listings. Family correspondence from the 1800s discussing Eastern treasure that required securing before borders shifted. Museum acquisition records with tidy handwriting, then sudden gaps exactly where you'd anticipate detailed origin stories. Not one definitive proof, rather dozens of small absent pieces, and every absent piece indicated identically. Wealth connected to this territory existed, serious wealth, and at some moment it relocated. Now I need honesty with you about something. The instant you type Tartaria gold into search engines, you enter a danger zone. You'll encounter people claiming hidden vaults beneath every major metropolis. You'll see treasure seekers selling authentic charts for $500. You'll find forums where every unclear photograph becomes evidence of a secret civilization. That commotion, this loud, absurd commotion, isn't merely irritating. It's functional because it prevents serious questions from being asked. Who wants association with the person claiming giants constructed the Capitol building? Nobody. So researchers retreat. Historians avoid the subject. Journalists laugh and continue onward. And the genuine documentary trail, the boring, powerful component, just sits there untouched, concealed beneath internet jokes. Here's what I decided differently. I'm separating what we can demonstrate from what we can't. I'm not selling you a treasure fantasy. I'm following documentation because the documentation indicates a very particular kind of narrative, one that's not about hidden caverns, but about something more mundane and more troubling. The transfer of state wealth during a period of massive political transformation. Consider what was occurring in the 1800s. Empires were expanding, borders were being redrawn forcibly, railways were connecting territories that had been difficult to reach for centuries. Modern banking was replacing older systems of commerce, tribute, and local governance. When empires expand, they don't just take territory. They take treasuries, tax revenue, reserves of precious metals, religious artifacts, family wealth, anything portable, anything meltable, anything that can be packed into containers and shipped to a new power center. This isn't fantasy. It's how conquest operates. You can trace it across the Americas, Africa, and Asia repeatedly. Empire after empire. When it concerns the Eurasian interior, though, that enormous territory older cartography kept labeling as Tartary, the narrative becomes unclear. The documentation becomes sparse, suspiciously sparse. Not because nothing occurred there. We know things occurred there. We possess the maps. We have trade route notes. We have diplomatic correspondence discussing strong khanates and prosperous merchant cities. When you attempt following what happened to that wealth after borders shifted, you encounter obstacles, archives that were reorganized, collections that were consolidated, files that were lost during administrative transitions. That pattern, wealth exists, then borders change, then paperwork becomes unreachable, is exactly what you'd anticipate if someone was absorbing assets they didn't want traced. Consider this. If you were an expanding empire in the 1800s, wanting control of a wealthy region's precious metals and trade commodities, would you announce it? Or would you redraw cartography, rename the territory, and let the old designation fade until nobody even remembered what term to investigate? Because that's not a treasure mystery. That's an accounting problem. And accounting problems leave documentary trails even when someone tries very diligently to conceal them. So I had cartography showing a designation fading out. I had whispers about wealth that seemed to transfer in the identical time frame. But whispers don't prove anything, and maps can always be explained away as European confusion. If I wanted this to exceed vibes and suspicion, I needed something stronger, something connecting the designation, the currency, and the timing together. That's when I started discovering the clues, not hidden exactly, more scattered across different archives, different nations, different languages, like someone took one clean narrative, tore it into fragments, and filed each fragment in a different drawer. Clue 1. The cartographic editions. When you align European maps from the 1500s through the 1800s, you notice something significant. Tartary isn't one fixed configuration. Sometimes it stretches from the Urals completely toward the Pacific. Sometimes it's split into sections. Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary. The boundaries shift, the subdivisions change, the details move around, but the designation stays for roughly 400 years. And that matters. A placeholder doesn't behave that way. A placeholder doesn't get subdivided into categories. A placeholder doesn't have routes drawn through it like it's part of a functioning world. A placeholder doesn't appear in correspondence as a territory people traverse, trade through, negotiate around. Whatever Tartary indicated, whether it was one state, numerous states, or a catch-all designation, something genuine was being described, genuine enough to name repeatedly generation after generation. And then in the middle 1800s, the designation stops appearing on new cartography, not reduced, not softened, just absent. Clue 2. The cartographic transition. Here's what historians will tell you, and they aren't incorrect. Maps got sharper in the 1800s, surveying improved, measurements got better. The blank spaces filled with genuine borders and genuine place names. So they say Tartary disappeared, because Europeans finally understood what was actually there. Okay, that sounds reasonable, but here's the problem with that explanation. When a vague designation gets replaced by precise knowledge, you anticipate gradual change, old names fading while new names rise, overlap, coexistence, a messy middle. That's not what I observed. What I observed was closer to a hard break. 1 decade. Tartary is printed on nearly every major European map. Next decade, it's gone, replaced by Russian territories, Chinese provinces, and new administrative names that sound modern, official, and bureaucratic. No lengthy transition, no overlap, just replacement. Almost like someone decided the old word had to stop being used. Clue 3. The timing, and this is where the pattern starts feeling uncomfortable. The 1800s weren't only the century of better cartography, they were also the century of wealth being pulled inward and concentrated. Railways connected territories that had been slow to reach. Banks grew stronger. Empires tightened control over places they once influenced only loosely. This is the era of central banks, the era when local treasuries and regional wealth start getting absorbed into capital cities, and the treasure narratives tied to Tartaria, the family whispers, the auction house notes, the museum gaps, cluster in this exact period. Not the 1600s when maps were rougher. Not the 1900s when the new system was already locked in. The 1800s. The transition window. The moment when older structures were being folded into newer ones. Now I'm not claiming I possess a single perfect document stating __quote _4 with a tidy date stamped on top. I don't. But I do have a pattern. A designation that persists for centuries then vanishes abruptly. A map improvement narrative that happens faster than normal change would require. And wealth rumors clustering in identical decades when empires were consolidating control over the territory those maps once labeled. If you were going to relocate treasure quietly, not as dramatic theft, but as administrative takeover, this is exactly the century you'd do it. Because people don't question a border change. People don't audit a reorganized archive. And people can't search for wealth that was relabeled before anyone even knew what to ask. These clues don't indicate a treasure chest. They indicate a system. And systems are harder to notice and easier to hide. At this point, I need telling you something that might sound like I'm sabotaging my own investigation, because when I investigated deeper into what Tartary actually meant on those antique maps, I found the first genuine twist. And the twist is simple. Tartary was never one empire. Historians are correct about that component. The term was a blanket designation, a European catch-all for an enormous territory they didn't fully comprehend. It covered dozens of different peoples, different languages, different political structures, Mongol remnants, Turkic Khanats, nomadic confederations, settled city-states along the Silk Road. Tartary was less like France and more like the Middle East, a wide geographic designation that lumps very different worlds under one convenient word. So when skeptics say Tartary wasn't a genuine country, they're technically correct. There was no single Tartarian monarch, no unified Tartarian currency, no Tartarian constitution. When I first realized this, I honestly thought, okay, maybe I've been pursuing a phantom. Maybe the designation disappeared because it was always meaningless. Just European confusion finally getting corrected, case closed. Except the mystery didn't get weaker, it got stronger. Because here's what a blanket designation can hide. If Tartary covered dozens of different political entities, then Tartary also covered dozens of different treasuries, dozens of tax structures, dozens of reserves, precious metals, commodities built up across centuries of commerce. The Silk Road didn't run through empty wilderness. It ran through cities, prosperous cities. Cities that taxed caravans, minted coins, built palaces, funded armies, and stored wealth in genuine vaults. Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, designations that still echo with narratives of currency and power. These weren't primitive outposts. These were economic centers, often more organized, more connected, and more sophisticated than people imagine today. So when the Russian Empire pushed south in the 1800s, when the Qing dynasty tightened control over Western territories, when the great game between Britain and Russia turned Central Asia into a chessboard, a simple question becomes unavoidable. What happened to all those treasuries? What happened to the wealth that had been accumulating in those cities for centuries, sometimes over 1,000 years? Here's the uncomfortable component. We don't really know. Oh, there are records. A conquest here, a tribute payment there, a collection donated to an imperial museum under circumstances that don't feel fully voluntary. But for the scale of wealth that should have existed, centuries of Silk Road profits piled up by some of the most successful trading cities in human history, the documentary trail is remarkably sparse. That's when I realized something significant. The blanket term isn't a weakness in this investigation. It's the point. Because if you wanted to blur what happened to regional wealth during imperial expansion, a vague designation is your best friend. You don't have to erase records from the Khiva treasury. You just stop using the word Khiva and start calling the whole territory Russian Turkestan. You don't have to explain what happened to Bukharan precious metals. You file it under Central Asian acquisitions, and the narrative loses its sharp edges. The blanket term Tartary didn't hide one unified empire. It hid the complexity underneath. And when the blanket finally got pulled away, that complexity didn't become clearer. It became harder to see, not erased, just recategorized, broken into so many new administrative fragments that nobody can easily trace what existed before, or what moved where, or who signed what. That is a cleaner way to make wealth disappear than burning records or sealing vaults. You don't destroy evidence, you change what it's called, and then you wait. Because after enough time, nobody even remembers what word to investigate. So when people tell you Tartary was never genuine, they're correct in the narrowest sense, but in the broader sense, they miss the real trick. The cover narrative isn't that Tartary existed. The cover narrative is that it never mattered, and the longer I kept examining the evidence, the harder that narrative became to believe. By now, I'd spent weeks staring at cartography, tracing old routes, and reading auction records with gaps that felt a little too clean. And somewhere along the way, the investigation changed configuration. Because I didn't start this as a narrative about power. I started it like a treasure hunt. The romantic variety. Hidden vaults, lost hoards, a secret stash that a person could theoretically stumble across. But that's not where the evidence kept indicating. It indicated something less cinematic and much more unsettling. This wasn't pirate treasure. This was state treasure. And state treasure doesn't behave like treasure in adventure narratives. It doesn't sit in one chest waiting for a brave explorer to discover it. It moves through systems, quiet ones, tax collection, war levies, tribute payments, confiscation after conquest, nationalization during regime change. State treasure gets absorbed. When an empire takes over a territory, it doesn't leave the local treasury untouched. It inventories, it tallies, it transfers, it melts coins stamped with the old ruler's face and mints new ones with the new ruler's face. That component isn't shocking. It's normal. It's documented. It's what empires do. Here's what makes the Tartaria question different, though. When Britain took control of India, We have records, detailed ones. We can point to famous transfers. We can see accounting trails even when they're dirty or corrupt. We can trace at least roughly what was taken and where it went. When Spain conquered the Americas, we also have records. Ship manifests, treasury reports, complaints from the crown about missing shares and governors skimming off the top. The precious metal trail is messy, but it exists. When the Russian Empire absorbed Central Asia, though, when the Qing tightened control over Xinjiang, when territories that older cartography grouped under the Tartary designation were carved up into modern borders, the documentary trail gets sparse, not completely absent, sparse enough to show wealth existed, enough to show conquests happened, enough to show administrative control tightened, but not enough to trace with genuine precision where the accumulated wealth of Silk Road cities actually ended up. That gap, that specific variety of gap, is what flipped the narrative for me. Because missing records aren't neutral. Missing records means someone chose what to preserve and what to let fade. Missing records means someone had the power to shape what future generations could or couldn't prove. When you're discussing the 1800s, the century of modern bureaucracy, modern archives, and paperwork for everything, tax receipts, grain counts, even cavalry horse inventories, a gap that large doesn't feel like an accident. It feels like a choice. So I stopped asking quote 5 and I started asking a different question. Whose treasure are we really discussing? Because if Tartary was a blanket designation covering dozens of political worlds, then the wealth wasn't Tartarian in one clean, unified sense. It was Bukharan treasure, Kievan treasure, Samarkand treasure. Kokand, the accumulated wealth of khanates and city-states that had been trading, taxing, and storing value for centuries. When those territories were absorbed, relabeled as Russian provinces, Chinese administrative regions, protectorates, dependencies, the wealth didn't vanish. It changed hands. It changed designations. It was folded into bigger imperial treasuries that had very good reasons to be vague about where new wealth originated. Because here's the quiet truth about conquest. It's easier to justify when the conquered appear poor. It's easier to claim you're civilizing a territory if that territory doesn't have a clear, documented history of wealth and sophistication. And it's much easier to keep what you take if nobody remembers it belonged to someone else. So the treasure hunt became a power narrative, not quote 6, but quote 7. Because the treasure isn't magically missing, it just changed designations. And the designations are conveniently the identical ones that faded from cartography. So if the treasure wasn't hidden, if it was absorbed, then the genuine question becomes, how do you trace something that was deliberately relabeled? You follow the routes, because wealth doesn't teleport. It moves along paths, roads, rivers, railways, the identical corridors that carried silk and spices for centuries. And those corridors didn't vanish when the designation Tartary faded off cartography. They just got new designations too. Look at Central Asia on a terrain map, not a political one. Look at how mountains force travelers into narrow valleys. Look at how rivers act like natural highways. Look at where oasis cities grew simply because that's where the water was. Those facts don't change when borders shift. Samarkand is still where it has always been. The Fergana Valley still funnels movement identically to how it did in the 1400s. The passes through the Tian Shan still squeeze traffic through identical choke points. And for centuries, those routes carried wealth. Not just silk, not just spices, precious metals. We know this because we have descriptions from people who used these paths and wrote about what they observed. European merchants writing about precious metals moving west, Chinese records describing tribute moving east, Arab geographers describing wealthy cities where caravans paid taxes and precious metals. The wealth was genuine. The roots were genuine. The cities that gathered that wealth were genuine. So when empires absorbed those cities in the 1800s, the wealth didn't evaporate. It moved along identical corridors, just pulled toward different power centers. Here's what I mean. When Russia pushed railways into Central Asia, the tracks didn't cut through random places. Engineers followed geography. They built where movement was already possible, where the land naturally guides people and cargo. But railways change one key element: speed, and railways changed another: volume. If you wanted to relocate a treasury from a newly conquered Khanate to an imperial capital, a railway is exactly what you'd use. Fast, heavy, organized, hard to interrupt once it's operating. And we do know, this is recorded, that Russian forces captured significant treasures during the Central Asian campaigns. The conquest of Khiva in 1873, the conquest of Kokand in 1876, the tightening control over Bukhara. These weren't quiet office transfers with polite signatures. These were military operations against wealthy states. So what happened to the contents of those treasuries? Some objects ended up in museums. Collections like the Hermitage hold Central Asian pieces with provenance descriptions that stay carefully vague. Some wealth was likely melted down because it's easier to fold metal into reserves when old markings and old designations are gone. And some of it we simply can't trace because the records from that exact window for those exact transfers are strangely incomplete, not missing in a dramatic way, not burned in a bonfire with a villain laughing, just incomplete enough that a full accounting becomes impossible. That's the pattern I kept encountering. Not total erasure, selective gaps, enough paperwork to confirm something happened, not enough detail to prove exactly what moved, when it moved, and who signed off on it. So the roots are still there. The geography hasn't changed. The railways that replaced caravan paths are still operating. But the documentary trail has holes in the exact places you'd need to fill to connect the wealth to its new owners. Almost like someone understood which pages would matter later and ensured those pages didn't survive intact. The roots told me how wealth could have moved, but routes are abstract, lines on cartography. I needed something physical, and that's when I started examining the buildings. Not palaces, not museums, the boring buildings, administrative centers, old courthouses, banking halls built in the 1860s and 70s, the variety of structures empires construct when they're consolidating control over new territories. What I found was strange. Building after building with basement levels that don't match official floor plans, stairwells that lead to bricked-up doorways, rooms that appear on old blueprints but don't appear on modern ones. I first noticed this in St. Petersburg, an administrative building from the 1850s with a basement layout that makes no sense unless you assume there's another level below that isn't shown. Then I found identical patterns in Tashkent, in Orenburg, in cities along the old routes into Central Asia. Government buildings with vault-grade construction, thick walls, reinforced foundations, limited access points, but no official record of what those vaults were built to hold. When I tried finding inventory records for these buildings from the conquest period, I hit identical obstacles I'd been hitting everywhere else. The records exist partially. You can find maintenance logs, construction expenses, staff assignments, but the actual inventories, the lists of what was stored in those carefully constructed basement rooms, missing, transferred, reclassified, lost during administrative reorganization, identical phrases repeatedly. Now I want to be careful here. Missing inventory records don't prove hidden treasure. Old buildings have weird layouts for lots of reasons. Maybe those bricked-up doorways just lead to condemned sections. Maybe the vault-grade construction was for mundane document storage. Here's what bothers me, though. When I looked at similar buildings in Western Europe, banks, government archives, treasury offices from the identical period, the documentation is meticulous. We know what was stored where. We have inventory records going back centuries. For the buildings constructed along the Central Asian expansion corridor during the exact decades when conquered treasuries would have been transported, though, the records get sparse. The construction is documented, the contents are not. When local researchers have tried investigating, I found a few academic papers, mostly in Russian, mostly from the 1990s. They hit identical obstacles: access denied, records unavailable, no historical significance. That last phrase appears frequently. Buildings that clearly had significance, strategic locations, vault construction, high security features, dismissed as having no historical significance the instant someone asks what was inside them. It's not definitive proof, but it's a pattern. Buildings designed to store something valuable, records that should document what that something was, and a consistent, systematic gap exactly where the documentation should be most complete. The vaults exist, you can see them. What was in them and where it went is a question no one seems authorized to answer. The vaults were one variety of barrier, physical brick and concrete. But the bigger barrier was made of paper, or rather the absence of paper. Because at some point in every investigation, you have to go to the archives. You have to sit down with the actual documents and trace the actual chains of custody. That's where I hit the genuine barrier. Not locked doors, not armed guards. Something more frustrating. The records had been reorganized. I started with the Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg. Millions of documents from the imperial period, meticulously catalogued. I searched for Tartary. Nothing relevant. I searched for the specific Khanates, Khiva, Kokand, Bukhara. Some results: diplomatic correspondence, military reports, but treasury records, transfer manifests, inventories of seized assets. Okay. So I looked up the Ministry of Finance archives, regional administrative files, and on and on. Each reference pointing to another archive, another collection, another reorganization. It's not that the records were destroyed, it's that they were scattered, broken into fragments, and filed under different headings in different institutions across different countries. Some now in Russia, some in Uzbekistan, some in Kazakhstan, some in collections that were lost during the Soviet period and may or may not still exist. The documentary trail isn't hidden, it's fragmented. And when I talk to researchers who specialize in this period, archivists, historians, people who've spent decades navigating these systems, they all said identically, it's not that the truth is hidden, it's that it's filed somewhere else, and quote 11 keeps changing every few decades. Another reorganization, another consolidation, another transfer that moves documents from one system to another, each time losing a little more context, a little more connection to what came before. One historian told me something that stuck with me. She said the imperial period records were detailed. The Soviets were obsessive about documentation too, but the transitions between systems, 1817, 1917, 1991, those are where things disappear. Not because someone burns them, because the new system doesn't know what to call them. That's the elegant component. You don't need a conspiracy to lose information. You just need 3 or 4 regime changes, each with its own filing system, each with its own priorities for what gets preserved and what gets boxed up and sent to a warehouse. The archive barrier isn't built by villains. It's built by bureaucrats doing their jobs, reorganizing, consolidating, reclassifying, without any single person deciding to hide anything. The result is identical. A researcher looking for Tartarian treasury transfers finds nothing, because that's not what anyone called it by the time the records got filed. And the question nobody asks is, what was it called instead? Because that question requires knowing what you've lost. And that's exactly what the reorganizations prevent. There's something I've been avoiding, something that makes this entire investigation harder to discuss, and I need addressing it now, because if I don't, you'll think I'm ignoring the obvious problem. The problem is this. Tartaria has become a magnet for nonsense. I'm not discussing legitimate historical questions. I'm discussing the other stuff. The mud flood theories, the reset narratives, the claims that every old building was actually built by giants or free energy civilizations, or whatever the algorithm is pushing this week. And I understand why serious researchers run away from this subject, because the instant you say Tartaria, you get grouped with people claiming that world fairs were actually demolition projects for a secret empire. It's embarrassing, and it's not just embarrassing. It's dangerous, because the scam layer is genuine. I found people selling authentic Tartarian maps for $500. Maps you can download from library databases for free. I found treasure hunting schemes promising investors access to secret vault locations in exchange for funding. I found entire communities built around fabricated evidence, photoshopped images, misattributed quotes, documents that don't exist in any archive. The grift is genuine. People are making currency from this. And the louder the grift gets, the easier it becomes to dismiss the entire subject. That's the dirty secret. The scam layer doesn't just exploit the mystery, it protects the mystery. Because every serious researcher who might ask legitimate questions about wealth transfer during imperial expansion looks at the Tartaria space and thinks, I'm not touching that. Every journalist who might investigate suspicious gaps in treasury records sees the mud flood videos and decides the narrative isn't worth the reputational risk. Every academic who might publish on Central Asian economic history during the conquest period knows that the instant they use certain words, their work gets associated with conspiracy theories. The commotion isn't accidental. I'm not saying someone designed it this way. I'm not claiming there's a committee somewhere generating absurd theories to discredit legitimate inquiry. But the effect is identical. Genuine questions get buried under loud nonsense, and the people who benefit from those questions never being asked don't have to lift a finger. The scam layer does the work for them. So let me be clear about where I stand. I don't believe in mud floods. I don't believe in reset civilizations. I don't believe that every old building is hiding free energy technology. What I believe is much simpler. Empires took wealth during conquest. They always have. And some of that wealth, specifically the wealth of Central Asian Khanates absorbed during the 1800s, is poorly documented in ways that deserve serious investigation. That's not conspiracy. That's colonial history. But as long as the conversation stays polluted with obvious nonsense, the serious questions stay marginalized. And that might be the most effective cover of all. Not silence, but noise. So much noise that the signal gets lost entirely. I need telling you about the moment I almost gave up, because every investigation has one. The point where the evidence stops cooperating, where the clean narrative collapses, where you realize you've been building a narrative that the facts don't fully support. For me, it happened in a footnote. I'd been tracing a specific claim, a treasury transfer from Khiva to St. Petersburg after the 1873 conquest. Multiple sources referenced it, the numbers seemed consistent. I thought I finally had a solid thread. Then I found the original document. Or rather, I found a reference to where the original document should have been, and it wasn't there. Not classified, not restricted access, simply not there. The catalog said the document had been transferred to the Ministry of Finance archives in 1879. The Ministry of Finance archives said the collection had been consolidated in 1924. The consolidated collection had no record of the specific document ever existing. It had been referenced in secondary sources for over a century, quoted in academic papers, cited in footnotes, but the original was missing, relocated, lost during wartime evacuation. The clean narrative I'd been building, empires absorb treasuries, records get scattered, follow the roads, started to crack, because without the primary sources, I couldn't prove the transfers happened the way I thought they did. Maybe the secondary sources were incorrect. Maybe the original documents never said what everyone claimed they said. Maybe I'd been building a theory on a foundation of footnotes, citing other footnotes, citing documents that nobody had actually seen in decades. That's when the second contradiction hit. The timeline didn't work. I'd assumed the wealth was moved during the conquest period, the 1870s, but some of the vault construction I documented was from the 1850s, before the conquests, before there would have been Central Asian treasury transfers to store. So either the vaults were built for something else entirely, or the timeline was more complicated than I understood, or I was incorrect. I sat with that possibility for a long time. What if the Tartaria treasure narrative was exactly what the skeptics said? A mishmash of unrelated facts forced into a pattern that wasn't really there. What if I'd been seeing connections because I wanted to see them? That's the hardest moment in any investigation. When intellectual honesty requires you to consider that your theory might be incorrect. But here's what kept me going. The gaps were still there. Even if my specific narrative was flawed, the absence of documentation was genuine. The fragmented archives were genuine. The vault construction with missing inventories was genuine. Something had been moved. Something had been obscured. I just had the incorrect map. That's when the investigation shifted again. What if the treasure isn't hidden in one place? What if it was absorbed so completely into banks, into state reserves, into new systems that there's no single hoard to discover? What if the treasure isn't missing? What if it's everywhere and nowhere? After the contradictions broke my theory, I did something I should have done earlier. I stopped. Not stopped investigating. Stopped reaching. Stopped trying to make the evidence say more than it actually said. Because there's a difference between following a trail and forcing a trail to exist, and I'd been doing too much of the second. So I went back to the beginning. I laid out everything I could actually verify. Not what I suspected, not what seemed likely, but what I could demonstrate with evidence that still existed. And here's what survived the reset. First, Tartary was a genuine cartographic term used consistently across European maps for roughly 400 years. This is not disputed. The maps exist. The designation existed. It referred to a vast territory of Inner Asia that Europeans understood imperfectly, but traded with actively. Second, the designation disappeared from cartography in the middle 1800s during a period of rapid imperial expansion by Russia and China into territories that had previously been labeled Tartary. The timing is documented. The disappearance is documented. Third, wealthy city-states existed along the Silk Road routes in this territory for centuries. Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, Kokand. These were genuine places with genuine economies and genuine accumulated wealth. This is not controversial. Fourth, these city-states were conquered by expanding empires in the 1800s. Military campaigns are documented. Conquests are documented. The absorption of these territories into Russian and Chinese administrative systems is documented. Fifth, treasury transfers during these conquests are poorly documented, not undocumented, poorly documented, fragmentary, scattered across archives, reorganized multiple times in ways that make systematic research extremely difficult. That's what I could prove. Not a hidden treasure, not a coordinated cover-up, not a secret vault waiting to be discovered, just a pattern of wealth existing, conquest happening, and documentation being insufficient to trace what happened to that wealth afterward. Is that suspicious? Maybe. But suspicious isn't proof, and I'd spent too long treating suspicion as if it were proof. So here's what I decided. I would stop claiming to know what happened. I would start asking better questions about what we can't know and why we can't know it. Because the interesting thing isn't, where is the treasure? The interesting thing is, why is it so hard to answer that question? We have archives, we have records, we have historians who specialize in this period. And yet when you try tracing the economic consequences of Central Asian conquest, you hit barriers that don't exist for comparable colonial expansions elsewhere. That asymmetry is genuine. I can't prove why it exists, but I can document that it exists. And sometimes documenting the shape of a gap is more valuable than pretending you can fill it. The treasure might be gone, melted, absorbed, renamed into systems we use every day. But the questions remain. And the questions might be more important than any treasure. Once I stopped pursuing the treasure, I started seeing something else. A pattern I'd missed because I was looking in the incorrect direction. What if the treasure was never the point? What if the treasure narrative, the romantic idea of hidden vaults and buried hoards, was itself a variety of misdirection? Think about it. Every time someone asks _14_, they're imagining a physical thing, a chest, a vault, a secret location marked on a secret map, and that framing sends them digging, literally sometimes. I found forums full of people planning expeditions to Central Asian ruins, convinced that if they just find the correct basement, the correct tunnel, the correct forgotten chamber, they'll discover what empires supposedly hid. They won't find anything, not because the wealth never existed, but because wealth on a state scale doesn't work that way. And here's the uncomfortable thought that kept me awake one night. What if the treasure myth is functional? What if letting people chase caves and crypts and hidden chambers serves a purpose? Because it keeps them from examining the genuine trail. The genuine trail isn't underground. It's in ledgers, in banking records, in the slow, boring process of how conquered assets get integrated into imperial economies. It's in land transfers, mining rights, railway concessions, trade monopolies. The wealth of Central Asia wasn't just precious metal bars. It was control. Control of Silk Road routes even as the Silk Road faded in importance. Control of cotton production, control of mineral resources, control of strategic geography that still matters today. If you wanted to distract people from asking how that control was acquired and who still benefits from it, you couldn't design a better distraction than a treasure hunt, because treasure hunters don't read banking archives. Treasure hunters don't trace land ownership through 3 regime changes. Treasure hunters don't ask how railway concessions granted in the 1880s shaped economies that still exist today. Treasure hunters dig holes and find nothing, and eventually give up. And the genuine wealth, the structural wealth, the control, the inherited advantages, stays invisible. I'm not saying someone invented the treasure myth for this purpose. Myths don't need inventors. They grow naturally around gaps in knowledge. But I am saying the effect is genuine. As long as Tartaria's treasure means a physical hoard, the question stays safely in the realm of adventure narratives and internet conspiracies. The instant Tartaria's treasure starts meaning the economic resources of a conquered territory and their systematic integration into imperial systems, that's when the question becomes dangerous, because that question doesn't lead to empty caves. It leads to institutions that still exist. It leads to wealth distributions that still shape geopolitics. It leads to asking who inherited what and on what legal basis. The treasure might be a decoy, and the decoy might be working exactly as intended. Not because someone planned it, but because it's easier to chase adventure than to read receipts. So if the treasure is a decoy, what's the genuine prize? I kept returning to that question, because if physical precious metals wasn't the point, then something else was. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I'd been using the incorrect definition of treasure all along. In the language of power, treasure doesn't always mean metal. It means control. Control of territory, control of resources, control of trade routes, control of the narrative people are allowed to tell about the past. And when you look at what actually happened during the Central Asian conquests, the pattern becomes clear. The Russians didn't just take treasuries. They took cotton fields. They took irrigation systems. They took mining rights for resources that wouldn't become valuable until decades later. They took railways. Not just built them, but controlled them. The Central Asian Railway wasn't a gift to the territory. It was an extraction system designed to move resources out and administrators in. They took administrative control, the ability to decide what got recorded and what didn't, what got taught in schools, what languages were used in official documents. They took the map itself, because when you control how a territory is labeled, what it's called, how it's categorized, what history gets attached to it, you control how future generations think about it. That's a variety of treasure that doesn't fit in a vault, and it's worth far more than metal. Think about what it means to erase a designation from cartography. It means the next generation doesn't know to ask questions about it. It means researchers can't find records because they don't know what to search for. It means the wealth of that territory, physical and structural, gets absorbed into a new system without anyone noticing the transfer. You can steal precious metals once, but you can steal memory forever, and memory is the most valuable resource of all. Because if people don't remember that wealth existed, they don't ask where it went. If people don't remember that a territory was sophisticated and economically developed, they accept the narrative that it needed to be civilized. If people don't remember the designations of the places that were conquered, they can't trace what was taken from those places. Tartaria's treasure might have been melted down a century ago, but the erasure of Tartaria is ongoing every time someone dismisses the designation as just a vague label. Every time an archive gets reorganized in ways that make research harder. Every time the conversation gets redirected to mud floods and conspiracy theories instead of documented conquest. The genuine theft isn't in the past. It's happening now, in the way we're trained to think about this territory, in the way we're trained not to think about it. The treasure was never just metal. It was knowledge, context, memory, and that variety of treasure doesn't sit in a vault waiting to be found. It has to be reconstructed piece by piece from the fragments they didn't manage to erase. After all that, the dead ends, the contradictions, the scam layer, the archive barriers, you might think I ended up with nothing. But that's not quite true, because some things survived. Not the treasure, not the ledgers I was hoping to find, not the clean documentary trail that would prove exactly where the wealth went, but anchors, small, stubborn fragments of evidence that refused to disappear no matter how many times the systems got reorganized. The maps survived. That's the first anchor. Hundreds of maps spanning 4 centuries, sitting in library collections around the world. You can look at them today. The British Library has them. The Library of Congress has them. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France has them. Tartary is right there, labeled, bordered, treated as genuine. No amount of dismissal changes what's printed on those maps. The cartographers of the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, they all agreed something was there, something worth naming, something worth mapping in detail. The architectural evidence survived. The buildings are still standing. The oversized doors in St. Petersburg administrative halls, the vault-grade basements in Tashkent, the railway stations built to imperial specifications along the old Silk Road routes. You can visit them, you can measure them, you can see construction that doesn't match official explanations. Bricks don't lie, engineering doesn't lie. The physical record is harder to reorganize than paper archives. The linguistic evidence survived. Place names, family names, words that trace back to roots that predate the conquest. Languages that were suppressed but not extinguished. Oral traditions that kept fragments of memory alive even when written records were confiscated or destroyed. The people of Central Asia didn't forget everything. They couldn't write it down safely for several generations. But they remembered, and now slowly some of that memory is being reconstructed by researchers working in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, scholars who have access to local archives and local languages and local oral histories that Western researchers never see. The pattern of absence survived. This might sound strange, but stay with me. When you document where records should exist but don't, when you map the gaps systematically, the gaps themselves become evidence. A gap in one archive might be an accident. Gaps in identical places across multiple archives, following identical timelines, affecting identical categories of documents. That's a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Sometimes it's evidence of removal. So I didn't find the treasure, but I found something that might be more important. I found proof that the questions are legitimate. Proof that something was there worth mapping for 400 years. Proof that something was taken worth hiding for 150 more. And proof that the systems designed to make us forget didn't quite succeed. The maps remember, the buildings remember, the languages remember. And slowly, piece by piece, the pattern is becoming visible again. Not because someone revealed the secret, but because enough small proofs survived to show us where to look. I started this investigation looking for treasure. I didn't find it. Not the variety you can hold. Not the variety you can put in a museum. Not the variety that would make headlines if someone dug it up tomorrow. But I found something else. I found a shape in the fog, a territory that was mapped for 400 years, then quietly erased. Wealth that was documented by traders and travelers, then absorbed into systems that kept poor records. Questions that should be simple to answer. What happened to the treasuries of conquered cities that somehow remain unanswerable? And I found the silence. That specific, consistent silence that surrounds this subject. The way serious researchers avoid it. The way archives become difficult to navigate the instant you ask certain questions. The way the conversation always seems to drift toward jokes or conspiracies instead of staying with the documented facts. That silence isn't neutral. Silence has a shape too. So let me tell you what I think. Not what I can prove, but what the evidence suggests to me after months of tracing fragments across scattered archives. I don't think there's a hidden vault somewhere with Tartaria's treasure waiting to be discovered. That narrative is too clean, too romantic, too much like the variety of tale that keeps people chasing shadows instead of asking structural questions. I think the treasure was genuine. I think it was substantial, and I think it was absorbed systematically, bureaucratically, boringly into imperial systems that had every reason to keep quiet about where their new wealth originated. Melted coins, relabeled assets, mining rights transferred, territory seized, trade routes controlled. The wealth didn't disappear. It changed form. It became railways and banks and administrative buildings and inherited advantages that still shape economies today. And the designation Tartary faded because it was convenient for it to fade. Because a vague designation makes for vague questions. Because you can't demand an accounting from a place that officially never existed. But the maps remember, and the buildings remember. And somewhere in fragments scattered across a dozen archives in a dozen countries, the documentary trail still exists, waiting for someone patient enough to piece it together. I don't have the complete picture. I may never have it, but I know more than I did when I started. I know the questions are legitimate. I know the gaps are genuine. And I know that every time someone dismisses this subject as just conspiracy, without engaging with the documented maps, the documented conquests, the documented gaps in treasury records, they're helping maintain a silence that benefits someone, maybe not intentionally, but the effect is identical. So I'll end where I began. If the treasure was genuine, and I believe it was, then it didn't vanish. It was relabeled, and the question isn't, where is it hidden? The question is, what else vanished with it that we're still pretending was never here at all? The past isn't dead. It's just been filed somewhere else. And the filing system was designed by the people who took what they took. Where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments which city or country you are from. We would love to know who is watching with us. Share your thoughts, observations, or questions. Every comment is important. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. Together, we are creating a community of curious explorers.